Welcome to the first presentation in our Spring 2018 lecture series for the Proseminar in Social, Political, and Humanistic Inquiry. How many people already know what Proseminar is? If you don't know what Proseminar is, raise your hand. Okay, so since 2008, the Social Studies Division has run Proseminars, and what they do is provide advanced students in the social studies the opportunity for intensive interaction with scholars and practitioners active across the broad spectrum of the disciplines, particularly in social science. Through lectures, symposia, seminars, readings, discussions, excursions, and scholarly writing, the Proseminar aims to nurture an intellectual community that bridges scholarship and citizenship through critical engagement with problems that impede the development of a just and sustainable global civil society. And we thought very much when we were first establishing the Proseminar of W.E.B. Du Bois, a social scientist and activist who inspires an ethos of transdisciplinarity, plurality, and multivocality. Du Bois was an early analyst of the relationship between capitalism, colonialism, race, global resource competition, and warfare, as well as an exemplary political activist who sacrificed much in his struggle for sustainable international justice. This semester, we have a different theme every year, and we usually try to develop methodologies that fit with the themes conceptually. So this semester, our working title is Undisciplined, Social Thought in an Age of Global Infrastructure. And our guiding question is, what should social thought be, and what might it become in an era of radically expanding techno-social networks? The 21st century is emerging as an international struggle for global hegemonic influence over infrastructure, the apparatus of trade, finance, mobility, and communication. This is recognizable in several forms, including, and this is not a comprehensive list, the growth of massive and monopolistic technology companies such as Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Twitter, the continuing imperial reach by Russia and the United States in multiple tentacular forms, both overt and covert, and the construction of an energy and trade network with global reach in the form of China's One Belt, One Road project. All of these infrastructures are based predominantly on the precarious socio-ecological foundation of fossil fuels, fossil fuel production and consumption, an energy infrastructure intertwined with militarized resource nationalism. All of these infrastructures are also defining and animating new identities and potentially new political economies. You can sit in the front. In every social domain, global infrastructure shapes, channels, and defines desire, personhood, and national identity while liberating the constituents from the burden of responsive, individual, and collective value formation. Global networks generate concentrations of wealth and power, but also less legible and more pervasive claims on ourselves as subjects of and to a global technocracy held up as benign and emancipatory for all who are willing to work, that is, to get a job. This tune, the leitmotif of globalization, shades every aspect of our lives. It is invasive. Critical aspects of the emerging infrastructure depend on unquestioned concepts and demarcations. Symbolic capital of a new order of scale and magnitude rendered in forms most pleasing to the eyes, ears, and taste buds. These offerings are synchronous with and constitutive of a disciplinary crisis in the social sciences, a situation demanding robust, thorough, and even undisciplined responses based on creative interdisciplinary restructuring and transdisciplinary vision. Our guest tonight has long embraced a transdisciplinary project designed to shed light on how modern political and economic power is intertwined within a fractious infrastructure of global resource production and consumption. His work convinces me that we are living in what can be called the era of fossil fuel capitalism, or petrocapitalism, in a political economic framework of heavily militarized neo-mercantilism based on massive arms trading and mutual suspicion. But this cannot last indefinitely, for reasons to be discussed tonight. And if we're lucky, vigilant and diligently devoted to collective practices of global environmental justice, we may someday look back with a mixture of shameful horror and self-recognition, but also with relief for having moved collaboratively beyond resource nationalism and endless militarization. If we fail, the outcomes are hard to predict, but certainly in need of serious and collective consideration. Tonight's visiting scholar exemplifies the combination of self-discipline and multidisciplinarity, or multidisciplinary vision, that we aspire to in this engagement with infrastructure and social theory. We see him as one who refused to be disciplined, and his readers are all the better for it. And I'll give you a little tiny glimpse of how he has refused to be disciplined. He tells me this afternoon that he was an art historian, active in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. And he was so active, he became a theorist of geopolitics. And he's still informed by his work in art history. And he showed us a lot of evidence of that this evening in the class this afternoon. But he's gone far beyond this original disciplinary investment. So let me introduce the person who will introduce our speaker, one of our very own proseminarians and a student whose work also exemplifies the rigorous commitments of multidisciplinary academic endeavor, and that is Mario Campbell, who is a junior concentrating in pre-engineering with a complement in economics. Let's give Mario a warm welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Michael Klare, Five College Professor of Peace and World Security Studies and Director of the Five College Program in Peace and World Security Studies, holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Columbia University and a Ph.D. from the Graduate School of the Union Institute. He has written widely on U.S. military policy, international peace and security affairs, the global arms trade, and global resource politics. His articles have appeared in many journals, including Arms Control Today, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Current History, Foreign Affairs, Harper's, The Nation, Scientific American, and the Technology Review. He also serves on the Board of Arms Control Association, the Board of the Arms Control Association, and advises other organizations in the field. His books include World Security, Challenges for a New Century. The first edition was published in '91. Rogue States and Nuclear Outlaws of '95. Light Weapons and Civil Conflict of '99. Resource Wars, Blood and Oil, and The Race for What's Left, his most recent work. I see Klare's Rising Powers, Shrinking Planet, The New Geopolitics of Energy, and other works as insightful merges between the past and the future. Klare's work speaks to the oppressive work of colonizers, providing us with historical background on current affairs and the adverse effects such phenomena will have on various nations, the United States of particularly no exception. It gives us insight as to what vital resources exist in countries around the world and breaks the fallacy of the United States' independence and inherent power. It aids and forces us to deeply consider the phantasmagorical reality of the world in this current geopolitical age, and meditating on its work enough, one can envision a thriving universal geopolitical system in the absence of US domination. Everyone, please help me welcome Michael Klare.
I'm awed by these introductions. I feel I'm not capable of living up to them. Thank you both very much. That was sort of overwhelming. Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming out. And I'm happy to be here. And as Mario said, I've studied many areas, most recently in areas of resource competition and resource conflict, but as a result of developments that have occurred in the past few years, I'm returning to what got me into this work to start with, which is militarism and war between the major powers, especially nuclear war. I haven't focused much on that because it seemed, for a while at least, for a blessed period of time since the end of the Cold War, that the risk of war among the great powers had diminished. And that doesn't mean that war disappeared. The United States is engaged in half a dozen wars now. In Syria, in Iraq it's winding down, in Afghanistan it's winding up, in Somalia, in Libya, in Yemen, the United States is involved, and probably 50 other small wars that you don't even know that there are American troops. It was only by accident that we learned that there are 800 troops in Mali fighting against guerrillas in that country, in Niger, in Mali, in Chad. There are all these hidden wars underway. So I don't mean to say that this period, this blessed period, has been without war, but we haven't had the prospect of war among the great powers and has capitalized GDP for a while. And a war between great powers in the post-World War II era means the prospect of nuclear war. And we've been relieved of that worry to a great extent. Most of you didn't grow up in the Cold War, so you don't know what it's like to have that worry hanging over your head. But now it's back. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. And I'm going to focus on, Chris, do you have that other document?
Yes.
Thanks. So in the past 3 months, the Trump administration has, I'm going to slip up. You'll give me a little wiggle room here. The Trump administration has issued 3 documents which all of us need to read and be familiar with. The first one was in December, the National Security Strategy of the United States of America. Then came in January, the summary, this is only the summary, the rest you can't get. The National Defense Strategy of the United States of America. These you could all get online. And finally, in the beginning of February, the Nuclear Posture Review. And it's mainly this one that I want to talk about. These 3 documents are setting out a new world view for the United States and guidance for the military, for the national security establishment, for the coming period. They guide how our military forces will be organized, funded, equipped, trained, deployed, and their focus. And it's exceedingly different from that of the Obama administration, and yes, the Bush 1 and 2 administrations and the Clinton administration. It's a sea change in thinking about security, national security strategy and military strategy. By the way, it's natural for all of us to slip into, say, our forces, our military, and you have to let me get away with that. It just comes out automatically. I'm talking about, you know, the forces of the United States, the policy of the United States government, not necessarily my policy or my forces, which they're not, but you'll understand if I make that slip. So this is guidance for American forces for the future, and like I said, it's an entirely new worldview. And I want to begin by talking about what this new worldview is. Maybe read some quotations from it. It begins with the premise that the world that we have lived in for the past 25 years or so since the end of the Cold War has ended. It's destroyed. And that world is usually described as the liberal world order or the international liberal order, that world is now dead, and we should no longer try to keep it patched together. That liberal world order, roughly speaking, assumes that that the major powers they may have differences of opinion and may have conflicts over issues, but have more in common, have more mutual interest in collaborating on the big issues of the time, and will work in international institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and others to resolve global problems, and that they're not going to go to war with one another and use nuclear weapons with one another. And will observe certain kinds of norms of behavior. This is a world that President Obama tried very hard to perpetuate, but so did his predecessors. Donald Trump says that world is finished, it's done with forever, and we're going to move swiftly away from it. And we have to prepare for a new world of great power competition, capitalized. This is the new world where the U.S. is challenged not only by a rising Russia, a resurgent Russia, a rising China, new regional threats from North Korea, Iran, but others in the future, India, Turkey, all of which are going to challenge American interests, and therefore we have to re-equip our military to engage all of these possible adversaries on multiple fronts simultaneously. Wonder if I could find some, well, here's from the Nuclear Posture Review. Since 2010, we have seen the return of great power competition. To varying degrees, Russia and China have made clear they seek to revise the post-Cold War international order and norms of behavior. That's how they phrase it. Revise, and they are called, Russia and China, revisionist powers, meaning that they seek to revise the international order as it is. And in doing so, the claim is that those countries, Russia and China, North Korea, Iran, are prepared to use military force in addition to everything else, and to challenge the U.S. and its allies and its interests in an aggressive fashion, and that the policies adopted by the Obama administration of accommodation have failed us, have encouraged these parties to become more aggressive, and therefore put the U.S. at greater risk. And therefore we have to reverse those policies and move in a more militaristic direction, and to contend with all of those other countries and race them, outbeat them in every possible sense. And to do that, we have to rebuild our military. Rebuild is somewhat of an ironic term because we already spend more than all of those countries put together, but we have to rebuild our military. And that we have to be prepared to counter those countries in places where they challenge us, in the South China Sea, in the Baltic area, in the Black Sea, in the Middle East, in the Korean Peninsula, wherever. We have to be in a position to be more aggressive ourselves, and that our country now has to be redesigned, re-engineered as a militarized great power. I could say a lot more about that, but what I want to do is talk about the most recent of these, the nuclear posture review, because I think this is the most dangerous and the one that has the greatest risk of destroying our world. And I don't like the thought of that, and nor should you. So I'm going to focus on the nuclear posture review. Now, what they mean by posture, what a posture review means, posture means, on one hand, an assessment of what the challenges and threats are, and then a statement of what policy the United States has to adopt to counter these threats, and what forces are necessary to implement those policies. So it's all of, that's what they mean by posture. What is the posture of our nuclear forces to contend with these challenges? Excuse me for a minute. So, anybody could download this, just Google nuclear posture review, and you could print it out and read it for yourself. It takes a little bit of, I'm going to try to help decode what it says for you, and then we could discuss its implications. So, the nuclear posture review begins by saying that the United States has fallen behind in the nuclear arms race, and that we have to race now, we have to run to catch up with our adversaries, namely Russia, China, and North Korea, and eventually Iran. In doing so, it means, as we do this, we not only have to modernize the existing nuclear arsenal, the existing U.S. nuclear arsenal, meaning all three legs, this is the way they talk, all three legs of the strategic triad. So just quickly, strategic nuclear weapons mean weapons that are aimed at the homeland of other great powers, Russia and China in particular. Triad, the three legs, why do we have a triad? When you enter the world of nuclear strategy, you're entering a strange Lovian world, a bizarre world. It's beyond comprehension. What do we mean by a triad? The belief is that the U.S. has to have the three entirely separate modes of nuclear retaliation, so that if two of them are wiped out by some hypothetical enemy, we still have one left that can completely abolish, eliminate, liquidate any conceivable enemy. So that means that the strategic triad includes land-based ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, of which we have 400, sea-based ballistic missiles from submarines, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which there are about a dozen submarines that can fire several hundred ballistic missiles, each of which has multiple warheads, and bombers, strategic bombers like B-52s and B-2s that can drop either gravity bombs or air-launched cruise missiles. And each of these are supposed to be survivable independently and able to liquidate the entire Russia or China. I mean, destroy all its cities and everything else independently. So we have to have three of them in case, God forbid, they attack us and wipe out two of the three. That's the logic that we spend billions and billions and billions of dollars a year and have all these things. So, argument is we have to modernize, replace all three of those. But in addition, and I'll talk more about this, the argument is that we have to close a gap, in quotation marks. If you know your Cold War history, we've gone through one gap after the other, a missile gap, a bomber gap, a satellite gap, a this gap, a that gap, where somebody is ahead of us. The claim is that Russia is ahead of us in deploying low-yield tactical or theater nuclear weapons for use in Europe, and we have to duplicate their advance in this category of low-yield nuclear weapons. Now, low-yield nuclear weapons doesn't mean you know, it's going to blow up just Simon's Rock. A low-yield nuclear weapon would destroy, let's say, Albany, New York, as compared to a strategic megaton bomb, which would, you know, wipe out all of New York City. So these things are intended for use on the European battlefield to destroy, you know, a Russian base or a NATO base or something like that. So low yield, don't think that these are pretty things. They'll kill tens of thousands of people and irradiate huge areas, but they're not the same thing as something that would wipe out all of Moscow and the surrounding area. So we have to acquire more of those to make up for the gap. In addition, we have to change our nuclear doctrine as part of the posture to make it easier for the president to push his button. Now, you talked about his button, if you're familiar with this. The problem is that there's a fear that President Trump, he has such a conscience that he may hesitate to use a city buster bomb when Russia attacks the Poland or Lithuania in some future scenario. Russia attacks Lithuania and maybe even uses a tactical nuclear weapon or just uses a lot of tanks, that our doctrine calls for responding with small nuclear weapons, but that President Trump, he has such a conscience, might hesitate to use these tactical nuclear weapons. Might hesitate to use the ones now in our arsenal, which are the New York City-size megabombs, and so not retaliate and give Russia an advantage. So we have to give the president a more flexible nuclear doctrine calling for earlier use of nuclear weapons in such a scenario, so that his conscience will be clear that he could order the use of smaller nuclear bombs first before calling on the use of bigger nuclear bombs. Now, put aside the fact that nobody believes once you start using nuclear bombs that you can control the size of them. This is absolute Strangelovian folly, but that's what it says. Okay. All this has profound consequences for us. It's going to result in a huge increase in military spending, and something will have to be cut, and it's probably will be education and health. It will naturally provoke Russia and China to do more of the same themselves, because if the US acquires more threatening weapons that might endanger their nuclear capabilities, the only plausible response for them is to build more of their own, so we will therefore become more at greater risk. And all of this means that the likelihood of nuclear weapons use rises. So we have to ask what's behind this, what's involved, what are the risks, what could be done. I'll go over some of this. And then we could get into a discussion about it, and you could ask me as many questions as you want. What's behind this? I think there's a clashing view of the world, altered view of the world situation. As I said, the Trumpians in the White House no longer believe that the liberal world order is intact. They feel that we've entered a period of great power competition, and they feel that the United States has to become more like Russia, more of a militarized power to compete, and therefore we abandon any commitment to international institutions like the UN or the World Trade Organization, and pursue an America First policy, meaning pursue our interests at the expense of the international order. And that in the disagreements among the great powers, forget that. We expect that our adversaries are not our friends and not our collaborators, but our potential enemies. Therefore, we can't work with them. We have to be prepared to counter them at every level, at any situation that might arise. And that this extends to nuclear weapons. And here, I don't know if I'm saying something that outrages people. I'm curious.
Study session.
What's that?
A study session.
Oh, study session. This is hard stuff. I admit this is hard stuff, and I think it's something we all have to try to figure out how to make sense of this. And to understand, you have to understand a little bit about the Obama approach to nuclear weapons. The last nuclear posture review was released in 2010 by President Obama, and he was very clear, that dear man. What he said is that it is the goal of the United States to reduce the role, this is almost an exact quote, to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our defense policy and to achieve as much as possible the reduction of nuclear weapons use internationally through negotiations. That was his objective, to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. strategy and to work with other countries, namely Russia, to reduce global stockpiles. And he didn't do a perfect job of this by any means. And among other things, to get government, congressional and military support, he did negotiate a treaty with the Russians called New START, which went into effect, can you believe this, 2 weeks ago on February, 3 weeks ago on February 5th. There's a milestone, February 5th, 2018. The US and Russia achieved their lowest mutually agreed upon reduction in nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, as a result of a treaty that Obama negotiated with Moscow, with Putin. So he did make progress. To get that approved by the Congress, it's a treaty, he agreed to begin work on the replacements, if need be, for the strategic triad. And I think that was a terrible mistake, but that's the price he had to pay. But the policy was to denuclearize our policy. What Trump is saying is that while we proceeded on that path, Russia moved in the opposite direction. Let's see if I can give you a quote about this. The word is salience. I think it's important to see how this is phrased. While the United States has continued to reduce the number and salience, meaning the role, the importance of nuclear weapons, others, including Russia and China, have moved in the opposite direction. They have added new types of nuclear capabilities to their arsenals, increased the salience of nuclear forces in their strategies and plans, and engaged in increasingly aggressive behavior, including in outer space and cyberspace. So we're the good guys. We've put our hands behind our back, while they have moved ahead in the opposite direction. So this includes not just in the nuclear era, but in all eras of being aggressive on the ground in Ukraine, in the South China Sea, pursuit of regional dominance, no mention, and I don't know how much time we have to go into all, no mention of NATO enlargement, which pushed NATO to the borders of Russia into former Soviet territory, or the US pivot into Asia, which so-called pivot into the Asia Pacific, which to China looks like encirclement, the threats to Iran and North Korea, and so forth. Most of all, it dismisses the fact that the U.S. still has the most powerful nuclear arsenal of any country. So instead, it says that Russia has proceeded to modernize its nuclear weapons, to alter its nuclear doctrine to make early use more possible, and to develop new weapons for use on the European battlefield. Now, this is highly contested territory, if you want to ask me about it. How far Russia has gone down this path is a question. It says China's advancing its arsenal. China has like 1/100th of the size arsenal as we do. It's a tiny arsenal, a few dozens of ICBMs compared to our 1,000 or so, 1,500 or so. So this notion that they're advancing while we're retreating is not based on fact. All right, so that's the claim. And as I say, the NPR calls for modernizing all three legs of the strategic triad, a new intercontinental ballistic missile called the ground-based strategic deterrent, a new nuclear submarine, a new bomber, the B-21 Raider, a new air-launched cruise missile, a price tag, $1.5 trillion for all of that, and then to acquire these new low-yield nuclear weapons, a sea-launched cruise missile that could be fired from submarines or ships with nuclear warhead. There are none of those now in the U.S. arsenal, and a low-yield sea-launched, submarine-launched ballistic missile. Also enhanced defenses, space, and so on. But more important, like I say, is an altered doctrine making it easier for the president to contemplate the use of weapons. Here's the language on that. We have to, given the range of potential adversaries, their capabilities, and strategic objectives, this review calls for a flexible, tailored nuclear deterrent strategy. Sounds benign, doesn't it? What it means is that we have to be able to use nuclear weapons under a wider range of circumstances. That's what tailored and flexible means. This review calls for a diverse set of nuclear capabilities that provides an American president flexibility to tailor the approach to deterring one or more potential adversaries in different circumstances. Basically, what it's getting at is to allow, as I said, President Trump or his successor to use nuclear weapons in a European battlefield or in an Asian battlefield earlier in a conflict rather than later. And this is what worries the most, because on one hand, it's going to make Russia and China have to create all kinds of defensive measures to deal with this, more cyber, more space defenses, anti-missile defenses, which the U.S. will then have to counter, so we get into an arms race situation. I think it's going to lead to weapons, the new weapons having more offensive first-use capabilities on both sides. So what does that mean? That means that if you see something on the screen, you're going to want to use your weapons earlier in the war, so it leads to a greater likelihood of early escalation in a crisis, a launch on warning, all around greater risk to everybody, if this all goes through. And the fact that we're making nuclear weapons more salient means that other countries are going to want to do the same thing around the world. India, Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. And so you have the breakdown of the non-proliferation regime, and we're in a more dangerous world. So, I think I've done enough of the bad news. What do we do about this? I think that's what the agenda is going to be for all of us in the coming months and years as this goes forward. Read the newspapers now, because this is all going to be part of the daily future that Washington is going to be dealing with. And I break that down into the specific and the general. The specific meaning addressing specific measures that are going to come up, like the financing of these weapons on one hand, and then there's a general. There was once in this country and around the world a huge anti-nuclear movement that put a stop to a lot of nuclear developments, the nuclear freeze movement and others. That has evaporated because the threat evaporated, as I said. Well, the threat is back, and we have therefore to create a anti-nuclear movement as there once was. And that's going to be, as you've seen, how women have mobilized and people have mobilized around Black Lives Matter and immigration rights. There has to be a similar kind of mobilization on these military issues and nuclear issues. That's sort of the general picture. Specifically, we're going to have to work on funding issues. Congress will have to vote to approve money for these things. And of course there's a lot of support for a strong military, but Congress just voted a $1.2 trillion tax break that's gonna have to be added to the national debt. And the president wants more infrastructure. That's going to add to the national debt. This is going to add another $1.5 trillion to the national debt. And there are at least some people in Congress who are worried about that. So at least we have to oppose, or I feel we have to oppose, buying all these new things. We don't need 3 strategic systems to liquidate Russia and China. For example, we don't need new small nuclear weapons. I think it's possible to organize opposition to those specifically. I think more could be done to take President Trump's finger away from the button by requiring congressional authorization for the first use of nuclear weapons. There's bills before Congress to require that. So there are specific measures, and there are groups working on that. As Marco said, I'm on the board of the Arms Control Association, which is a nonpartisan advocacy group for arms control and disarmament work. We work on that. Our website is www.armscontrol.org that follows these bills and and what their status is. Other groups, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, Win Without War, are all working to oppose the implementation of this. And I think that has to be part of all the other things that are being done. So I'll stop there. I think that's a good place for me to stop. I don't know if this is what you thought I was going to talk about, but that's what's on my mind, and I think it's what should be on people's minds, and it's a picture of where we're headed. It's a slice of this bigger picture that Chris described of the militarization of American foreign policy, and then this is where we're at today, a new world that resembles that of World War I period, where you had great powers competing for control of contested areas. The difference, that led to World War I and millions of dead. The difference is today all these countries are armed with nuclear weapons. So I'll stop there, And please give me your, you can disagree with anything I said, challenge my arguments, anything. But now I'm interested in what you have to say. One, two, please.
So when I was growing up back in the 80s and 90s, there was this concept I seem to remember from my childhood of nuclear deterrence being talked about. And that, of course, was absurd. And then also about some sort of concept of moral or ethical leadership in the world that's sort of incumbent upon the United States for some reason. And it seems like this whole, I mean, by those standards, this seems like this is a total capitulation to I mean, we live in this it's a finite world, and this sort of just in stark contrast to understanding that reality that it doesn't take any nuclear weapons to destroy the whole place, and so once you reach that point, it's an absurd game. So where did any grasp of reality go? Was it ever there?
Well, I think if you read the nuclear posture review of the Obama period, there was this vision that it's possible to imagine a world without nuclear weapons, and that it would be U.S. policy to move the world in that direction. And he laid out step-by-step moves to get there, and there are step-by-step ways to do that. And I could describe those. He talked about how to do that: reduce arsenals, move away from launch on warning, not acquire weapons that invite early use. Eliminate as many. It could go on. So there was a vision, and what Trump is saying is we throw that in the wastebasket, and he blames the Russians for this. Are the Russians guilty? Well, they haven't behaved well.
The only thing that says that.
So there's that, but that doesn't mean that the U.S. is guiltless, and that Obama is guiltless in this process. And I think it has to do with, we talked about this in the Proseminar earlier, the decline of American power relative to others, and a more competitive world, and in a sense, and this is what the last election was about. It was about a vision of Hillary Clinton following the Obama model of trying to increase international cooperation as a way of addressing world problems, and the Trump model, which is, I was going to use a bad word, screw the rest of the world, and we're going to pursue our own interests in a highly competitive world. And that's the direction we're going in, and that model, pursue our interests in a competitive world at the expense of everybody else, leads in this direction. So, I think that means we have to resist that path. I recognize you.
Yeah. In Proseminar, you talked for a second about North Korea, which I think for a lot of people is kind of the first thing in their mind right now in terms of Trump's nuclear policy. I was wondering if you had some more to say on it than what you said in class. You talked a tiny bit just about the upcoming exercises, which the U.S. and South Korea do every year, but also just about that in general.
Well, this is a sad story which has a history that's older than most of us, of the division of the Koreas after World War II, like Vietnam was divided, like Germany was divided. That's how it all began. between a communist North and an anti-communist South, one supported by China and Russia, one supported by the United States, and both highly militarized. I don't want to go into the history of the Korean War, but it ended with a status quo ante of a highly militarized North and a highly militarized South, and a regime in the North that constantly fears invasion by the United States. Whether that's accurate or not, if I lived there, I probably would worry about it. Especially if I were the leader, I would worry about it. They point to what happened to Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein as evidence that the United States is inclined to overthrow its enemies if they don't have nuclear weapons. So their strategy of deterrence, to use the word this gentleman used, to deter American invasion is to acquire nuclear weapons. Please don't anybody take it from me that I'm approving of any of this. I'm just trying to describe it the way they say it. They believe, that is the regime, that if they have nuclear weapons capable of striking the United States, the U.S. will be deterred from invading and overthrowing the regime. And they're avidly pursuing that. But that is a threat that for most Washingtonians is an unacceptable threat. Now, it's partly because we have demonized the North Koreans. We live with constant threat of nuclear attack from Russia and China, which have the ability to attack us with ICBMs like that. So it's not like we're not under threat from enemy ICBMs, but we have come to view North Korea having an ICBM as an unacceptable threat. Can we live with a nuclear-armed North Korea is a discussion we could have. That is to say, a status quo in which neither side uses its nuclear weapons. I don't like that world personally, but that's open to, we do live with enemies with nuclear weapons, but we have so demonized the North that that has become unacceptable. So how do you get rid of them? Well, you have two choices. You invade, or you obliterate the country and invade and overthrow the regime, and we could talk about what that would look like. It probably would result in millions of dead people and American soldiers occupying that for the indefinite future, and a world economic collapse. That's one option. The other option is to sit down and talk with them and work out some kind of mutual step-by-step demilitarization of the Korean Peninsula, in which the U.S. agrees to do things which we don't want to do, like remove our forces from South Korea. So there's no good option. But I think the negotiated path is better than World War III or something short of that, but very nasty. I quoted in a seminar what President Trump said the day before yesterday. It's going to be very nasty, and it's going to be awful, awful for the world if we have to use force, and we're getting closer to it, he said. So you can imagine. 1, 2.
What effects do you think the U.S.'s current military posturing, I'm specifically thinking of like Trump's intent to have a military parade, what effects do you think that will have on our quote-unquote adversaries?
Have effects on our adversaries?
Like what effects will stem from the U.S. trying to like flex its
Okay,
military
so put your heads in the mind. I mean, Russia and China are different. So from the Russian position, they're worried that the U.S. is moving towards a first strike capability. That is an ability to eliminate their deterrent. You all know what a deterrent is, right? If anybody doesn't know what a deterrent, I mean, so the Russians worry that the U.S. is trying to eliminate their ability to retaliate if we strike first with all of this, because it's not just modernizing our forces, but making them more capable. And also they worry about the anti-ballistic missile systems that we're putting up in Europe, which in Poland and Romania, which the US says are aimed only at Iran, but the Russians fear are the first stage to ballistic missile systems that could shoot down they are retaliatory missiles, right? So if you're Russia and you don't want a US first strike, and you fear that that's the ultimate outcome, you're going to have to multiply your attack systems one way or the other, or make them much more deadly, or use them sooner. And that's what worries me the most. In other words, you know, if you think the US is capable of a first strike and is moving in that direction, and you see a incoming radar signal that's dubious, but you can't be sure, you have to assume the worst. You have to move towards an early use policy. So so Russia, and they say this out loud, if you do this, we'll do that. So it puts the US at greater risk. The same thing with China. They're going to become more, they have to worry because their retaliatory capability is much weaker than Russia's. So they're going to have to vastly expand their nuclear capability. And I think they're going to develop short-range weapons to attack our bases in Japan and Guam, stuff like that. So it just makes the world more hair-triggerish. I think that's a good way to put it. There was somebody I recognize, yeah.
Yeah. So in the new doctrine, how exactly does it delineate like the strategic objectives for at all deploying the nuclear weapons? Like, for example, is it simply to disarm and demobilize, or is it, you know, we keep talking about this offense first, which sounds a lot like
No,
it's
they never
preemptive
use the
in
word
nature.
offense. They say tailored and flexible deterrent, meaning
Okay.
that's the language that our enemies have expanded their capabilities. Therefore, we have to be able to attack them in more ways and in more circumstances. For example, they say we have to worry about cyber attacks. So how do we know that, and it says it's legitimate to use nuclear weapons in response to a strategic cyber attack? Well, what is a strategic cyber attack, and how do we know it's from Russia or China or anybody else? Duh. I mean, but it's expanding the number of circumstances in which the US might use nuclear weapons. All on the premise is to deter our adversaries from engaging in aggressive or antagonistic ways.
So does it at all address, like, once these weapons are deployed, what is their main objective? Is it to...
Their main objective is to bring peace to the world. I swear. No, see, the argument is that we are peaceful people, and that Russia and China are bent on remember, they're the revisionists. It all begins with that. They're revising the world order. The current world order is nice. It's American-ruled world order, and it's peaceful. They want to revise the world order through aggressive behavior. So they're the troublemakers, and we have to protect the status quo against the troublemakers. That's what it says. I'm not making this up.
Okay.
I encourage you to read